What destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah was not only fire, but practices so disturbing that even their neighbors whispered in disgust. You feel the ground tremble beneath your feet. The night sky, once jeweled with stars, is now a furnace, flames streak downward like arrows loosed from a wrathful hand. Each impact tears open the earth, hurling sparks into the air until the whole horizon burns as if creation itself has been set ablaze. The wind is thick, choking with the stench of smoke and flesh. Every breath scalds your throat, every heartbeat drums against the roar of fire-consuming stone. Around you, the city screams. Walls collapse in thunderous waves, roofs buckle and vanish into embers. Men claw at doors that no longer stand, women wail as children vanish in clouds of ash. The streets that once echoed with trade and laughter are now rivers of flame where no foot can stand. You hear cries for mercy, but no mercy comes. Sodom is not merely dying, it is being erased. And yet, this destruction is not born of fire alone. The fire is the punishment. The true crime is older, darker, carved into the very marrow of these cities. In back alleys and banquet halls, behind curtains of silk and gates of stone, Sodom and Gomorrah fed themselves on corruption. Desire twisted into cruelty, power disguised as ritual, lust sharpened into violence. Here, pleasure was not intimacy, it was humiliation. The body was not sacred, it was currency, spectacle, sacrifice. Even their neighbors, empires hardened by war and conquest, recoiled at the rumors. They spoke in hushed tones of rituals that blurred the lines between worship and degradation, of acts so vile they could scarcely be put to words. What was whispered outside the city walls became a roar inside them, and what was done in secret was soon paraded in open squares. The Bible only hints at their depravity. The prophets speak in fragments, the verses shrouded in warning. Yet what survives between those lines, what emerges from apocryphal texts and ancient commentaries, sketches a picture more terrifying than legend allows. These were not cities of ordinary sin, but engines of excess, cultures that raised cruelty into law and called it pleasure, that inverted every law of hospitality and made violation their proudest inheritance. And when the fire fell, it was not only to bury them, but to seal away a memory that was too dangerous to survive. Yet memory lingers. Beneath the ashes and charred stone, archaeologists have uncovered traces, bones warped by heat, layers of destruction frozen in an instant, the imprint of a city that thought itself untouchable. The discoveries do not soften the story. They make it darker. You are not only watching cities die. You are standing at the edge of a grave where the earth itself has conspired to hide the truth. And what that truth reveals is not merely why Sodom and Gomorrah fell, but why their shadows still linger, whispering warnings across the centuries. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins not with fire, but with Scripture. In the book of Genesis, the account is brief yet haunting, cities whose sin had grown so great that the outcry against them reached heaven itself. The text is spare, almost evasive, as though the words cannot carry the full weight of what was seen. Genesis 18 and 19 speak of strangers arriving at the city gates, of a household surrounded by men demanding to consume what was not theirs, and of a host who pleaded, bargained, even offered innocence to protect honor, but the mob would not be turned away. The prophets, writing centuries later, attempted to put sharper edges on the story. Ezekiel does not speak of one single act, but of a culture, arrogance, gluttony, the neglect of the poor, the indulgence of every appetite while ignoring justice. Jude, in the New Testament, goes further. Describing Sodom and Gomorrah as cities that indulged in sexual immorality and pursued strange flesh, a phrase so blunt that later translators softened it, veiling it beneath euphemism. The earliest audiences knew what was meant, later centuries grew uncomfortable with the rawness of the charge. Beyond the canonical Bible, other voices tried to fill the silence. The Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis preserved in fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, speaks of Sodom as a place where every boundary was broken. The scrolls themselves, echoing ancient Jewish traditions, describe the sins of Sodom as violence clothed in pleasure, cruelty paraded as freedom. To read these texts is to feel the unease of scribes who struggled to capture the memory of a society that had inverted every moral law. What becomes clear, once the fragments are gathered, is that the destruction of these cities was not provoked by ordinary human failings. It was the culmination of something systematic, a culture built on the exaltation of appetite, pride elevated above compassion, desire turned outward into exploitation. The words "strange flesh," debated for centuries, suggest acts that blurred even the categories of human order, practices so disturbing that they strained language itself. Yet language was restrained. Translators through the ages softened these images, washing them with abstractions, shielding congregations from the naked violence at the heart of the story. Pride became arrogance, lust became sin, cruelty became lawlessness, words that smoothed over the horror of rituals that ancient texts once whispered with dread. It is here, in this silence, that one must listen closely, to the fragments, the echoes, the lines left unspoken. The weight of Sodom's story is not simply in its end, but in the reflection it holds to the human condition. A warning not only of fire, but of what happens when appetite is crowned as law, when the vulnerable are crushed for the entertainment of the powerful, when intimacy is distorted into spectacle. The prophets saw it as a mirror of their own times, a shadow that returned again and again in every empire that followed. If you've made it this far, you clearly want the truth. But are you one of those who listens to the darkest history, then refuses to support the one channel that dares to expose it? Tale of history needs your voice, don't lurk in silence. Night fell heavy upon the streets of Sodom. At the city gates, Lot, Abraham's nephew, met two strangers, travelers cloaked in dust, their steps quiet but deliberate. In a world where hospitality was sacred law, he knew what was required. He bowed low, pressed them to stay in his home, to share his bread, to rest under his roof. In the ancient Near East, to welcome a guest was not courtesy but obligation, a bond between host and heaven. To violate that bond was to court divine judgment. Yet as the lamps dimmed and the household settled, the streets outside grew restless. Whispers carried into shouts, footsteps gathered into a mob. Soon, the entire quarter was awake, men young and old, crowding around Lot's door. Their demand was chilling in its bluntness: bring them out to us, that we may know them. The word "know" here has always carried two layers: in one sense, to humiliate through forced intimacy, in another, to desecrate the very sanctity of the guest-host bond. Ancient rabbis wrote of this moment with trembling disgust, seeing not only lust but cruelty disguised as pleasure. Early Christian fathers echoed the same, interpreting the mob's hunger as an inversion of all moral order. And in the Islamic tradition, the tafsir of Sodom describes a people so consumed by appetite and arrogance that their desire was no longer desire at all, but violence ritualized. To understand the horror of this night, you must place it against the backdrop of the time. In Mesopotamian law codes, in Egyptian texts, in the customs of wandering tribes, hospitality was more than kindness, it was survival. To violate it was to strip society of its last defense against chaos. The men of Sodom were not seeking simple pleasure, they were performing dominance. To seize a guest, to strip him of dignity, was to announce that no law higher than appetite existed in their city. It was humiliation elevated into civic ritual. Lot pleaded desperately, even offering his daughters in a moment that shocks modern ears but was, to him, a twisted attempt to protect sacred duty. But the mob would not be swayed. They pressed harder, their shouts echoing in the night, until the strangers revealed themselves as angels, striking blindness on the crowd, scattering them in confusion. Still, the image lingers, an entire city, united not in welcome but in desecration. Jewish rabbis later interpreted this moment as the culmination of Sodom's culture, a people so corrupted that their greatest joy was in breaking sacred bonds. Christian writers saw in it the embodiment of sin so systemic that only fire could cleanse it. And the Islamic commentaries go further still, portraying Sodom as the archetype of arrogance, where even the presence of the divine was mocked at the threshold of a man's home. The horror of that night was not confined to the street outside Lot's door. For the whispers of the ancient texts suggest that behind closed doors, in hidden chambers, the elites of Sodom engaged in rituals far darker still, practices so obscene that scribes spoke of them only in fragments, and archaeologists centuries later would uncover traces that deepened, not lessened, the dread. Pause and ask yourself, why should tale of history be forced to compete with fluff channels, when we are the ones dragging forbidden truth out of ancient fire? If you won't subscribe, at least tell us in the comments why knowledge makes you so uncomfortable. There are stories, preserved in the Midrash and whispered through apocryphal texts, that paint Sodom in colors even darker than Genesis dared. Strangers who entered the city were not merely unwelcome, they became objects of sport. Ancient accounts describe a culture where the humiliation of outsiders was not incidental, but deliberate ritual. To strip a man, to degrade him with acts of sexual violence, was amusement for the crowd. Some writings suggest the Sodomites devised punishments that blended cruelty with spectacle, forcing travelers into unnatural positions, mocking them while crowds jeered. Their suffering turned into a theater of power. This was not lust in its simplest form, but appetite sharpened into cruelty. In the Midrash, one chilling tale tells of a young girl who offered bread to a starving stranger. When discovered, she was smeared with honey and left to the bees. A parable not only of violence, but of a society where compassion was outlawed, where mercy itself was seen as betrayal. When sexuality became entwined with this brutality, the result was not intimacy but torture, a public breaking of bodies to enforce dominance. Historians have long compared these accounts with fertility cults of the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamia, in temples of Ishtar, sacred prostitution blurred the line between devotion and exploitation. In Canaanite sanctuaries, ritualized sexuality was performed as offering, binding the body to the gods. But what Sodom seems to have done was far more profane, stripping away the sacred, leaving only the hollow shell of excess. The rituals there were not acts of devotion, but desecration, an inversion of what neighboring cultures still held as holy. Modern archaeology has added its own lens. Excavations at sites near the Dead Sea, believed by some to overlap with Sodom's remains, reveal a culture of sudden destruction. But also one of startling urban wealth before its fall. Palatial homes, luxurious trade, evidence of prosperity carved into stone. Scholars suggest it was this wealth that bred the arrogance described by prophets, a city fattened by abundance, its moral fabric collapsing under the weight of indulgence. What the texts describe as strange flesh may have been more than forbidden desire, it may have been the inevitable rot of a society where pleasure became law and violence its companion. Parallels emerge when we examine the Assyrian and Canaanite records of punishment. In Assyria, sexual humiliation was used deliberately against enemies, prisoners of war stripped, raped, displayed in chains, their degradation written into inscriptions as proof of conquest. In Canaanite cities, certain forms of ritual punishment combined nudity and exposure with violent ridicule, ensuring that shame was eternal, not merely physical. Sodom appears to have institutionalized this same cruelty, not as punishment for enemies, but as entertainment within their own walls. Through this lens, the destruction of the city takes on a sharper clarity. It was not merely the breaking of divine command, but the systemic inversion of every human bond, hospitality turned to violation, intimacy twisted into spectacle, wealth converted into cruelty. A city not only sinning, but celebrating sin as the very fabric of its culture. Others will click away right now, too disturbed, too fragile. But if you're still watching, you're exactly who Tale of History was made for. Prove it by subscribing, or explain in the comments why you'd rather stay a silent witness. The darkness of Sodom was not confined to the streets or to the jeering mobs. Ancient tradition insists that at its highest levels, among its rulers, its wealthy, its elites, the corruption took on forms more intimate, more hidden, yet more monstrous. Here, behind heavy doors and within halls of luxury, whispers tell of incest, ritualized orgies, and the deliberate collapse of every boundary that sustained family and society. Ezekiel's voice, centuries later, is often remembered for condemning arrogance, gluttony, and neglect of the poor. But he does not stop there. He speaks of abominations, a word that in Hebrew carries the weight of defilement, not simply error, but deliberate desecration. Scholars, comparing Ezekiel's language with Ugaritic texts, see connections to the fertility rites of Canaanite temples, where sexual rituals were performed not in private but in public, intended to stir the gods to bless the land. Yet in Sodom, the sacred was stripped away, leaving only indulgence. What was once framed as fertility became perversion, not to honor heaven but to gratify the flesh. The Midrash and later apocryphal writings go further, suggesting that among Sodom's nobility, incest was not an accident of secrecy but a pattern, a ritual of power. Fathers with daughters, brothers with sisters, flesh bound to flesh in acts meant to mock the very structures of kinship. In such a society, even family ties were not safe. Every relationship became another arena of dominance, another theater of appetite. This collapse of boundaries is what prophets saw as the true abomination, not only that desires were indulged, but that the very foundations of human dignity were overturned. The story of Lot and his daughters, which unfolds after the fire has already fallen, stands as a grim echo of this corruption. Lot, once the only righteous man deemed worthy of rescue, is left drunken, disoriented, his family destroyed. His daughters, fearing extinction, lie with him to conceive children. To many, this tale is a commentary on the infection of Sodom's culture. Even after escape, its shadow remained in their blood. The daughters' act was born of desperation, yes, but also of a worldview shaped by years in a city where boundaries were fluid and corruption normalized. The line between survival and sin blurred, leaving future generations marked by the memory of that night. In this, the story becomes psychological as much as historical. When corruption becomes culture, it reshapes the very imagination of those who live within it. What was once unthinkable becomes possible, and what is possible becomes inevitable. The destruction of Sodom, then, was not simply fire from the heavens, it was the inevitable collapse of a society that had already consumed itself from within. Some of you will soak up this knowledge, nod your heads, then scroll on, refusing to subscribe. If you're that person, I want you to at least admit in the comments why Tale of History isn't worthy of your support after delivering truths others won't touch. Archaeology has a way of whispering where texts grow silent. Along the southeastern edge of the Dead Sea, ruins lie buried under centuries of salt and sand, places scholars have long pointed to as the possible footprint of Sodom and Gomorrah. Bab Ethra and Tal el-Hammam are names that stir both fascination and debate, for what has been unearthed there seems to bear the scars of a destruction as sudden as it was absolute. At Bab Ethra, archaeologists uncovered vast cemeteries, their tombs violently disrupted, their structures charred. The city itself appeared to have been consumed in a cataclysm of fire, leaving behind layers of ash several feet thick. At Tal el-Hammam, the evidence is even more chilling. Walls melted into glass, pottery shards fused under temperatures no ordinary blaze could reach. Scientific analysis suggests a heat so intense that only an airburst, perhaps a cosmic event, like a meteor exploding above the plain, could have unleashed such fury. The city was flattened, its people annihilated in an instant, their memory preserved only in ruin. Skeptics, of course, offer their explanations. Was it divine fire, as the Bible claims? Or was it nature's wrath, a natural disaster interpreted by ancient witnesses as judgment? Geologists point to seismic instability along the Dead Sea fault line, to the presence of flammable bitumen and sulfur that could ignite in a massive earthquake. Others argue for the cosmic strike theory, citing parallels with the Tunguska event in Siberia, where an unseen force from the heavens scorched the earth. Yet even among the skeptics, the coincidence is striking, a culture remembered for its sexual violence and corruption destroyed in a blaze that wiped it clean from the map. For the faithful, the link is direct, the abominations of Sodom drew judgment, and the fire was no accident. For the historian, the archaeological record shows how fragile civilization can be, how cities built on power and indulgence can be erased in a single night. And for those who walk among the ruins today, the silence of the salt-encrusted earth seems almost to whisper of sins too terrible to be named aloud. Think about it, the ground itself remembers. Yet many of you will take this 20-minute journey and walk away without lifting a finger for Tale of History. Don't be that person. Either subscribe, or confess in the comments why silence feels easier. The story of Sodom did not vanish with the smoke that once rose over the plain. It survived in the tongues of prophets, in the warnings of priests, and in the laws of empires yet unborn. In Jewish tradition, Sodom became the archetype of what happens when mercy is outlawed. Rabbis taught that the sin of the city was not only its lust, but its cruelty, its hatred of strangers, its punishment of generosity, its inversion of hospitality. The tale was retold generation after generation as a mirror held to every nation that grew fat on wealth while neglecting justice. In Christianity, Sodom's shadow stretched long. The Epistle of Jude and the letters of Peter turned its name into shorthand for sexual excess, a cautionary tale of cities that pursued strange flesh and suffered eternal fire. Early church fathers wielded the memory of Sodom to condemn not only same-sex practices, but every form of lust untethered from what they called divine order. In sermons, the very name of the city was spoken as a word of dread, a reminder that indulgence leads only to ashes. Islam, too, preserved the legacy in the Quran and the tafsir of later scholars. The people of Lot were remembered for arrogance, corruption, and practices so unnatural they mocked the natural law established by God. Their punishment was invoked as a sign, not only of destruction, but of divine precision, a reminder that no city, no matter how strong, is beyond the reach of judgment. From these traditions flowed laws that shaped societies for centuries. Medieval codes outlawed sodomy with punishments as severe as execution, framing such acts as the very sins that had doomed Sodom. Prohibitions against ritual prostitution, carried over from earlier fertility cults, were enforced under the shadow of the story. Even the use of sexual humiliation as a tool of violence in warfare was condemned by pointing back to the night when Sodom surrounded Lot's house. The story did not merely live, it was weaponized to police desire, to enforce morality, to warn rulers that their cities, too, could be reduced to salt and ruin. But in modern times, the story of Sodom has been twisted into new shapes. Politicians invoke it as a rallying cry, religious leaders as a cudgel, its name dragged into arguments it was never meant to bear. For some, Sodom is reduced to a single act of lust, stripped of its wider culture of arrogance, cruelty, and violence. For others, it is used to vilify entire groups, ignoring the prophet's warnings about pride, greed, and the oppression of the poor. The legacy of Sodom, once a haunting reminder of human corruption, has become a tool in battles far removed from its ancient ruins. And so, the question lingers like smoke above the Dead Sea: was Sodom destroyed for lust alone, or for something deeper, a culture built on cruelty, on the exaltation of appetite, on the crushing of the weak beneath the pleasures of the powerful? The texts, the ashes, and the echoes all suggest the latter. Sodom was not simply a city of desire, but a city where desire became law, and where law itself became violence. The lesson, perhaps, is not confined to ancient ruins. It is the warning that when wealth blinds a people to justice, when cruelty is made into spectacle, when intimacy is perverted into domination, the foundations of a city crumble long before fire falls from the sky. The fire of Sodom still burns, not in the sky, but in memory. Its smoke drifts through Scripture, through law, through the whispers of cultures that survived its fall. Every generation retells the story, not only as a relic of the past, but as a warning etched into the future. You have walked with the prophets who struggled to find words, with the rabbis who shuddered at its cruelty, with the archaeologists who unearthed glass and ash fused by unimaginable heat. You have seen how lust was only the mask, while pride, greed, and domination were the skeleton beneath. And yet, even as we speak of ancient ruin, the shadow of Sodom lingers in the modern world. Cities that celebrate excess while silencing compassion. Powers that turn humiliation into spectacle. Cultures that raise appetite above law. The destruction of Sodom is not a story locked in stone, it is a cycle, one that begins wherever human arrogance makes cruelty acceptable. What we choose to remember, or forget, will decide if we repeat it. You've walked through fire, heard whispers the Bible only hints at, and seen what archaeologists unearthed. If tale of history dares to drag this truth from the ashes, then silence is betrayal. Subscribe, and if you refuse, leave your reason below. Let the world see why you'd rather hide from history.